But right now I'm going to present the last keynote of this conference. And it's Annika E Nilsson from Stockholm Resilience Center, right?
Stockholm Environment Institute.
Almost right. So, please welcome Annika.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank the organizer for a wonderful night yesterday. I think it was a wonderful illustration of the connection of local culture with the global. And it just provided a very, very pleasant mix. So thank you, and I think I can speak on behalf of everyone here about that. When I received the invitation to speak here, I have to admit I haven't heard about your organization before, so I had to kind of go in and look it up on the net. And what I found are many of the same concerns and issues in the sense that I face when I look from environmental politics and environmental governance in general. And I think it speaks to the increasing role of interdisciplinarity in understanding the world today. And I will raise some of those issues of maybe trying to expand your horizons to interact with even further disciplines than you may already be doing. And I will do it by linking with my own work in the Arctic. And try to broaden also the notion of the commons. And this is a little bit experimental in my thinking, and if it flies or not, I don't know. But a shared resource that I talk about is adaptive and transformative capacity, which is not normally how you would think about a common, but we'll see if it's a worthwhile venture or not. But I will start giving a little broader introduction. And my roadmap for today is talking a little bit of the challenges of the Anthropocene, the time we're moving into, that, and then focusing on the need for thinking about resilience. A little bit specifically on the role of surprises and the unknowns, the things we can't plan for, the things we can't base on our experience from the past. And leading up to the need to prepare for change. But then also asking, who is responsible for resilience? How does one think about this then in relation to the kind of areas that you're studying, the commons framework? We are all very familiar with the notion of sustainability, and is explicitly focused on maintaining a resource so that it's also there for future generations. Maintaining, I would argue, is maybe no longer an option. If you ask 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I think the impetus in the Arctic was we have to cut down emissions of greenhouse gases so that we can maintain the ice in the Arctic Ocean and other resources. In 2007 came the shock, when a lot of the ice in the Arctic Ocean was suddenly gone, in spite of the fact that none of the science had predicted that this would happen. This is in 2012, this image, but as you see, the Arctic Ocean isn't white anymore. In Swedish, Norra Ishavet, the Northern Ice Sea, is for part of the year not really an ice sea in the same way it has been anymore. So I think this is an echo not only of a single incident, a single issue coming for 1 year. It is a harbinger of a completely new geography that we're entering into in the Arctic. And the Arctic is one of many places where these changes are taking place. And climate variability as such is nothing new to the Arctic. People living there have always adapted to and dealt with climate variability and climate change over time. It's part of life. And there are numerous examples of how people have adapted to not only climate change, but also all kinds of social changes. And I just wanted to point you to the Arctic Resilience Interim Report that was published in May last year. And one example that you can read about there from the southwest Yukon, how people have dealt with not only repeated climate change, new species moving in, but also the building of an Alaska highway, the sudden influx of miners, and all these issues, by, in a sense, learning to live with change, by nurturing not only biodiversity, but diversity in general, diversity in institutions, and combining different types of knowledge and using opportunities for transformation when they come about. So, in a sense, what I'm taking up is not new, but yet, as you will see, there is also something new. But just as a little advertisement, and if I have one copy that I will leave here, but it's available on the web, and anyone who's interested in having another copy can just contact me and I will send you one. Yet something is new, very new. And the implications are really only starting to become apparent. We know beyond doubt that the impacts of climate change go way past previous experience and way past natural variability. And for this audience, it might not seem like one really would need to repeat that. I spoke last week for parliamentarians of the Arctic region. It's like they had spent a day and a half without even talking about climate change. It appears as if that has moved off the agenda. So that's why I actually repeat that, because I think it needs to be repeated. And the signs we see, they go way beyond the sea ice. You see the kind of line with the sea ice, and you can see we were the 2007 sea ice minimum here. And I actually got the 2014, which is not a new minimum, but follows the same general trend. But it's also greening of the Arctic. About 1/3 of the Arctic has become substantially greener since the 1980s. And new species are moving in or becoming less abundant. So another thing one saw visibly in the southwest Yukon was the spruce bark beetle and the enormous damage this has done on the forest, vast areas, which then triggers forest fires, or it doesn't trigger the forest fires, but they make the forest fires become much larger than they would if it hadn't been so many trees dying. So there are all these signs. You have permafrost getting warmer, causing erosion along the coast, forcing villages to consider relocating. So it's not just little teeny things in the environment that you have to be in kind of a scientist to go out and study a specific aspect. It's issues that are hitting visibly on community welfare. And the quality of snow and ice is changing, both on lakes, also lake ice, not only the ice in the Arctic Ocean. And in this new world that's unfolding, maintaining resources in many cases may no longer be an option, because there are forces out there that kind of on a steamroller already rolling along. And because we are committed to substantial additional climate change from the emissions that are already out there. Even if we cut emissions to zero now, we would continue having further climate change. And that fundamentally alters the whole context of resource management. And change, if one listens to the debate, one gets a feeling, okay, it's 2, 3, or 4 global average temperature doesn't sound so bad. But in reality, change comes often as rapid events. We have had a large forest fire in Sweden, not in the Arctic, that the planners hadn't really counted on having that big a forest fire. And of course, for that region, it has immense implications. It changes the whole system. Landslide at a very local level changes the whole ecology of that specific region. And change is likely to come in these kinds of smaller versions of tipping points. Breaking up old structures In this case, ecosystem structures. In the case of landslides, it's the ecosystem structure. In the case of a forest fire, it can be both the ecosystem structure, but also actually the social structure around that ecosystem, depending on how large the forest fire is and how that specific setting looks like. And the new structures that come in this void may or may not be desirable for human well-being. It's easy to see this for ecosystems. It might not be quite as easy to see it in the larger social context. But it is also true in the social and political context, especially, I think, when the social actors are caught by surprise, as they were in the 2007 sea ice minimum. The far-reaching implications of climate change that came then had not been predicted by the ice scientists. I mean, they had come up with a major assessment of Arctic snow and ice issues a few years earlier, said nothing about this being possible. The IPCC said nothing about this being possible. The planning on the International Polar Year had to be redone because it suddenly happened. Because they suddenly had to measure a bunch of other things. And politically, I didn't hear anyone in the Arctic in the early 2000s talking about the Arctic we see today. And so what happened was that it opened up for new ways of seeing the Arctic. You started getting these lines on maps where, oh, here's the sea route, here are new potentials, here are new opportunities. You started getting flags planted at the bottom of the North Pole, getting reactions then. This was the Russian flag, and then you get Canada, no, it's our sovereign rights, getting this political dynamics playing in. You get countries like China getting very interested in the Arctic, sending ships, doing lots of research, and wanting to buy into resource opportunities in the Arctic. You get countries like Denmark increasing their military activity in the Arctic. It's not something that anyone, I think, in say 2005 would said was likely to come only a few years later. And what happens was that you get a completely different media picture of climate change from being a threat in the sense of the natural environment to being one with increasing attention to security and sovereignty, to economic opportunities, to focus on oil and gas resources, and also increasingly now on mineral resources. And over just a few years, environmental politics, which had been fairly low politics, very cooperative environment, turned into one of high politics and high stakes and high national stakes. And also something that very quickly turned into a discussion of the governance of this region. There were discussions, a lot of actors, both NGOs and some states, not the Arctic states, to say, well, this is a global common that we have to protect. We have to have an Arctic treaty mirrored on the Antarctic treaty, that this is a joint responsibility. And of course the states with territory in the Arctic said, no, this is our national territory. And what instead happened was that they asserted their national state interest, and self-interest became much more prominent in the political discourse than it had been before. So, in a sense, you get, some people talk, oh, this is a commons, great, but the reaction becomes, in a sense, the opposite, and focus on state interests. And the argument that it goes against then the legal framework that actually regulates the Arctic, which of course is the UN Convention of the Law of the Seas, and this is I think, pretty much up-to-date map of the claims, the marine jurisdiction of the extended continental shelf that the Arctic Rim states have or have claimed. And as you see, there isn't a whole lot of the Arctic that's left that's not claimed under any kind of national territory, not even the North Pole. So the issue of the commons in the Arctic, in sense, goes counter to the legal framework of the UN Convention of the Law of the Seas. And I think the legal framework is what, from a legal point of view, has a much stronger position, of course. And that's what you get. And there is some areas where commons issues are still central, and that's in the Central Arctic Ocean. There's some land or some areas where fisheries are not relevant today because you can't get there. But if the ice melts and fishery fleets move in, there is currently no regulation, and there are people pushing for there needs to be some kind of regulation of fisheries there. But it's fairly small regions. The rest will be governed by national jurisdictions, for better or for worse. In some countries that probably works pretty well, and you probably have pretty good regulations, just as we have it now. In other countries that might not be the case. But it's not an issue that would be solved with viewing the Arctic as a commons. But the point I want to make is that by asserting the Arctic Ocean as a commons, or the Arctic as a commons, actually triggered strong self-interest in this new geography, and that the discussion got entangled with the securitization of the whole all Arctic issues as part of a complex web of developments, where the unexpectedness of the 2007 sea ice minimum, I would argue, played quite a strong role, because no one had really planned for it suddenly opening up so much. And it became entangled in high politics, such as resource and energy security, and military security, and sovereignty. This is, of course, the Arctic, but the Arctic issues are part of a global context. And this global context is not a static one. It's one that is in a state of very rapid, fundamental change. And the implications go far beyond climate change. You have the carbon dioxide issues, but you also have the water use, the motor vehicles, the total GDP, the species extinctions. I put just a few here. You have tons of similar curves. And that's, of course, what many people talk about, that we're in the Anthropocene. It's a development that accelerated greatly in the 1950s, and we are starting to see some of the implications more clearly, but I don't think we really have understood what the implications of these things are, which in a sense further emphasizes the issue I brought up in the beginning, that one can't think of resource governance as something taking place in a fairly static environment, neither social nor ecological environment. It's taking place in the context of rapid global change, both environmental and social. And just as one other example, climate change is, of course, one we talk about a lot, but you also have a chemical intensification of the economy, increasing number of chemicals being used, and you see the impacts of that more in some areas than the other. Arctic is one of those areas that have been hard hit by that because of the cold climate and because the way that air masses move, and because of the way that the food chains look like in the Arctic, where they're dependent on fat. So you have levels of contaminants in wildlife and in people that are high enough to cause concern about human well-being. especially children's development. It has led to, for example, the picture on the right is from an epidemiological study of the impacts of PCBs and mercury in the Faroe Islands, where they showed basically that the levels of contaminants in people were high enough to affect children's cognitive development. The positive side of that, there are two positive sides. It led to changing diets, and the levels are now going down. Of course, changing diet, they had to leave some of the traditional food, which whale meat was the most important source in Faroe Islands. So it's kind of a mixed if that's positive or negative, but the positive thing is that study, along with a lot of other material, was basis for that we now have a global convention on mercury. But these are some of the realities where people in the Arctic have faced very difficult decisions. Should we continue eating certain foods? When and how is it okay to breastfeed? How do we balance? I mean, those are not the kind of choices you really want to face. And as I will come back to later, it has actually eroded the resilience because some food sources are not as attractive anymore that could otherwise be used. Another thing that's, I think, is becoming more and more apparent, and that is that land is becoming an increasingly scarce resource. Also in the Arctic, also in areas that are not very heavily populated. You have Yamal in Russia, where reindeer herders and oil and gas development they're in the same areas. The upper hand picture to the right looks like a vast expanse, but it's the reindeer herding calving grounds where there are discussions about reopening a mine. It's in Kautokeino. Norway, oil and gas development around Lofoten and the crashes in relation to fisheries. And of course, there are several examples from Sweden where these issues have also led to quite strong protests and leading to a lot of distrust and conflict at the local level. And what I would say with this is that the global changes that are, in a sense, coming to the Arctic, and I think it's probably true for many other regions of the world as well, is creating new challenges for local governance, because there are factors that are coming in that local governance arrangement have not evolved to deal with. They're coming in from the outside because of this global connectivity in combination with the rapid global change that's going on. And especially I think that this multi-scalar issue is that when governing something, you don't only have the local actors, you also have the global actors. Creates a real challenge in relation to issues of trust, in relation to issues of social control, all those things that I'm sure that you have discussed a lot in your commons research. How do you think about those when you suddenly have completely different types of actors coming in, actors who might not even be present in the local context? Going back to the global context, I also want to highlight that the social processes connected to globalization, ongoing industrialization, have a strong path dependency, and this state of change. And some people also actually talk about that we are facing global tipping points, some of which are in the Arctic. What happens if all the ice melts? You might have a runaway climate effect when rather the ice melts. Or methane releases from the tundra, also risk of runaway climate effects. These kinds of tipping points have been part of the discussion, and that we should be aware of furthering the issue of we can't think about change as necessarily being gradual and slow. It might become much faster. But tipping points, most tipping points that have been identified are very much the global, biophysical ones. But I also want to point at the social tipping points. And using two historical examples from the Arctic, the bombing of Pearl Harbor led to a strong incentive to be the highway through the Yukon territory, where there were no roads. So they built the Alaska Highway so they could get military equipment to Alaska to fight the Japanese, Americans. This led to opening up that whole area where the First Nations had their traditional way of living, led also to a lot of politics where children were put in residential schools with a lot of destruction of indigenous cultures. So in a sense, you hear the Pearl Harbor affecting the social well-being of indigenous people in the Arctic, as one example. It's not something you would be able to predict in the sense of. There are also, it can go bad, it can also, I think, go better. The second one, starting with the interest in oil and gas in Canada, and the wish to build the pipeline through Canada, which led to the Berger Commission and the Berger Report that highlighted both the rights and the social well-being of indigenous people in Canada, and actually served as a basis for Arctic indigenous political movements, and the fact that Arctic indigenous peoples are represented in international fora today. So it's not necessarily that all social tipping points are bad, but it's also difficult to foresee these kinds of developments. And we should be aware of that when we look at resource management, however widely we define resources. So what I think my point is that we really need to prepare for change. And preparing for change is, in a sense, two different things. One is to increase the adaptive capacity, but it's also starting to think about transformation. Some transformation may not be transformation that we really want, but it will happen no matter what. The Arctic sea ice, I think, is such an example. But one can also think of transformation that we realize we really need to transform, which raises other questions. We need to transform away from a fossil fuel dependent economy. That raises questions of how do you guide and how do you govern that type of transformation, which also a lot of tricky decisions to make in that. And that's, I think, where the resilience thinking is useful, because it provides a way of an integrative approach to assessing linked social ecological changes across scale and identifying the risk of threshold effects and building capacity to respond. And that's a little bit of what we started trying to do in this, and the work continues. It is not easy. I can't say we know exactly what we're doing. We're trying to learn as we're going. But looking at these linked systems and both understanding the differences between a biophysical system and an ecological system and a social system, they're linked, but they're also different. For example, the social systems have actors that have wills, that have agency, that the climate system itself does not have. So these issues come in. But what we really want to get at is understanding better what are the features of these systems that give them the capacity to handle threshold changes, other changes, and still, in a sense, being able to keep a core identity, or if not being able to keep a core identity, at least being able to transform in such a way that you keep some core values related to human well-being. And what those core values, I say very related to human well-being. But of course, that is always a social negotiation. What are these core values? And of course, in the past, resilience has been eroded. And options for change have actually been compromised by past decisions and interventions, not least the ones that have eroded traditional sources of resilience. This is from a workshop in Keynote, where we try to map a little bit of that and see, in a sense, how a lot of political decisions, we heard about the SIDA system yesterday, have actually eroded some of the resilience that was there before. And I think this is the kind of learning that we need to do. But if we can erode resilience by political decisions, that means we can potentially also build resilience by political decisions, if we know what we're doing. And one way of trying to structure ideas of what it is that we need to safeguard is to look at adaptive and transformative capacity. And in the resilience report, in one of the chapters, another chapter kind of lists this as different types of capital, and one can discuss the language of capital. There are lots of issues in relation to that I won't go into, but I'm keeping with this terminology anyway. And of course, natural capital are the ecosystem processes that provide us with all kinds of goods that we need, everything from food to clean water, regulation of water flows. And the issue is, what are the features of those systems that they need to have in order to keep giving us those goods, even in a changing climate, even in a changing context? So it's not just maintaining the old one, but it's also how do you ensure that they can keep having those functions, even in a changing world. And we know that ecological resilience is already eroding. I talked about the chemical contamination earlier. We have other things that we build infrastructure on places that really otherwise would have been able to provide resilience and stuff like that. So it's something that one needs to look at. Social capital, society's capacity to work collectively in solving problems, and I think the one to point out here is the need for ability to solve problems across scale. It's not sufficient to look at one level, and it's not only the networks; it's also the trust issues in it, which are actually probably the most complex and difficult. Human capital, skills, competences, leadership, which is, of course, linked to the fourth aspect, knowledge assets, which play a key role for collective ability to perceive and understand change and also to translate it to action. Fifth, cultural capital, which is broad and I think partly overlaps with social capital and, in some cases, also to natural capital. Fifth, financial capital, having money to make the necessary investments. But you can't exchange that for something else. Money, you can have money, but it doesn't give you necessarily drinking water if you have poisoned your well. So it's not interchangeable. And the last one is infrastructure. These issues, I think, are also linked to security, at least not in the broad sense of human security. And we need to analyze, in a sense, how the securitization of a region such as the Arctic affects the political capacity to enhance adaptive and transformative capacity, generally. What happens when we get strong self-interest, in this case nation-states self-interest? How does that affect our ability to also make collective decisions, international collective decisions that need to be made? And some features of this, as I would then a little suggest, and I'm not sure whether it works, I leave up to you to, in the sense, think of whether it works, to think about adaptive and transformative capacity as a shared resource, as a potential commons. So that's what I'm posing here. And it's a bundle of resources that come together because they are interrelated. They are complementary rather than interchangeable, as I said. Sometimes they can be partially interchanged, but not completely. They're also difficult to quantify. You might be able to quantify financial resources, but natural capital has not been very easy to do, even if there are attempts. And it's only partially understood, I would argue, and very poorly monitored for the most part. And I think there's a lot of basic research actually needed to better understand the interrelationships within this bundle of resources, whether you put it in these 7 types of capital or if you find some other listing, it doesn't really matter for the argument, but looking at them and how do we understand their relationships? Is it possible to monitor or quantify or semi-quantify them in such a way that you can actually talk to the policy world about, look here, it's eroding, it's building. Here we actually have to make political decisions to provide policymakers with a tool to pay attention to these issues. And global change and potential of transformation has implication also for the notion of the commons as such, since this is a shared resource, as I said, but it doesn't answer the question of who is responsible. And here we again get into this local global dimension that I talked about earlier. We had China talking about, we're a near Arctic state, we should have a say in the Arctic because we are affected by climate in the Arctic. Climate change in the Arctic, which is true. They are highly affected by climate change in the Arctic. Of course, the Arctic states say, well, it's the Arctic states that decide in the Arctic. How do we deal with that? And take in the reverse. Indigenous peoples, especially people relying on traditional foods, are heavily affected by contaminants coming partly from China. Should people living in the Arctic have a say in Chinese politics? So these issues are the local and global. And I think also the issue of eroding resilience I talked about earlier. We have ecological resilience eroding. How and where should responsibility be taken for that? Some of that might be captured in the international conventions, but that's only part of it that's captured in the international convention. But also the social erosion, the erosion of trust, not the least, is something we'd have to think about. On the other hand, it has also been strengthened, I would say. This such thing that we have international environmental cooperation today, which we did to a much larger extent than 20, 25 years ago. We have increasing knowledge about the systems. And I think we also have an international discussion of common goals in relation, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals. So there are also positive things. One thing I would like to see more of is a link to how do these issues relate to other global political goals, such as peace, issues of security. And I would have to hurry up here to leave a little bit of time for questions, but I alluded earlier to the issue of the need for transformative change. Are we ready? And the issue that it would require choice, not only learning about getting more knowledge about what we already know and getting the systems working, fine-tuning the systems, it really requires re-evaluating a lot of basic assumptions, including how our whole energy system works globally. But that's probably not the only assumption, the whole consumption society. There are probably a lot of assumptions at the local level that we have to re-evaluate. Also some that we think are good traditional issues that we need to re-evaluate. And suddenly this is no longer an expert issue. It's not something a bunch of scientists can think of what we do. They try, and then they try to come with suggestions, so this is how we should do it. And usually it doesn't happen that way. The politicians don't listen, and even if the politicians listened, the implementation probably wouldn't work anyway. So it's not an expert issue, and it's an issue that requires an immense amount of trust in the discussions to even be able to reevaluate all the assumptions. So these are some of the challenges of the link global, local commons challenges. So what I would suggest then for further research is in your commons work and in other work that relates to it is to look very closely at the issue of trust in the local, global, connected world. The issue of fit. You know, where do we actually have the governance? It seemed easy at one point, but how do we deal with the issue of fit when we really have these global, local connectivity? And the role of, and related to that, the role of nation states in a global world that needs local engagement. I also want to raise the issue of collective versus private ownership. I was at our parliamentarians meeting, as I said, a lot of mining people talk there. One person talked, before it's yours, it's mined. Talking about minerals, it's a discourse that has the onus on private ownership. Where do these resources, adaptive and transformative capacity, end up in that? Where do we see the ownership in not in terms of ownership in the legal sense, but ownership in the social sense? And also, last but not least, that I haven't talked so much about, but how do we relate these issues to high-level political priorities? Sustainable development is not so difficult to relate to. The issue of security, I think we also need to increasingly address. It's a tricky one, but I think we need to go there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now we have some time for questions. And somebody told me yesterday it would be good if you state your name and university before you ask the question. So please, Conrad, you're waiting.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I think we are all aware of the impact of climate change, but this, I may say this personally for me, has raised my awareness for these issues. My main point is that usually natural scientists who have done a lot of work to show the long-term impact of climate change then conclude by saying what social actors should do, what they should do. But it's even more important to first to look what they can do. Mm-hmm. So I think we are a lot in the area of wishing, of unproductive wishing. So what can social actors do individually, collectively, over a lot of scales and so on. Mm-hmm. And then we have to be aware that humankind has never been able to solve social dilemmas of this size. Then we would have no wars. The social dilemmas behind many of our wars are much smaller than the social dilemma regarding mitigation of climate change and also adaptation. So my plea would be to stop wishing and to look where are the limits of social construction? Where are the limits of social construction regarding such a large issue? Secondly, you talked a lot about governance, what should happen, political priorities, more trust, infrastructure, and so on, and increasing what natural scientists call adaptive capacity. Natural scientists often go into the area of social sciences and then call it adaptive capacity. Okay, I'm afraid we are again in the area of wishing, because what is called social adaptive capacity in these communities is change of behavior. Nothing else than change of behavior vis-a-vis adaptation and mitigation issues in climate change. And behavior, individually and collectively, depends on institutions, on sets of rules. And this is not sufficient if you really manage to set up rules, formally or informally. They have to be put into practice by some forms of organization, what we call governance structures. Governance structures make rules effective. And there are again the limits of social construction. So my suggestion would be to switch from these normative approaches to real micro-analysis of issues of institutional change.
Well, I think if I break down your comment into two, one is the to not do wishful thinking. That's, in a sense, why I'm arguing for linking this discussion to the issue of security, because that is the high political priority of nation states that have the power in the world. And we need to understand that link. We need to make that link clear as researchers, as in various forms that we act, but as researchers trying, because those are completely different discourses today. And you have a political discourse where, yes, national security will put all efforts we can into it, but there are linkages between those, and that, I think, is one of the things in terms of wishful thinking. You aren't going to have a world where all governments suddenly say, yes, we are going to solve the world's problem collectively. I fully agree with you there. But showing also that it actually is in the national self-interest to address some of these issues, I think at least part of what we need to do as a way of getting away from the wishful thinking. As for adaptive and transformative capacity, yes, and now, of course, I talked about it at a very, very general level. But what I want to link it to is the monitoring. The successful things that we have seen in terms of environmental governance at the global scale has been where there has been very strong data on what is happening. For example, that the levels of PCB are so high in the Arctic that there are cause for health concern. That actually was quite important in getting an international global convention against persistent organic chemicals. That kind of basic monitoring. Similarly, I think we need to find measures that can capture what I call adaptive and transformative capacity, that one can use for communicating with policymakers directly, where they can look at the decisions they are making and the decisions that they are not making, and evaluating them in relation to how it affects adaptive and transformative capacity. At the same way as, in a sense, there's in most politics, you have, when you come with a suggestion, you have to evaluate, does this cost something? Money-wise. It's part of, in a sense, the routine when committees come with suggestions and stuff. You could potentially think that you could actually pose the same question. How does this decision affect adaptive and transformative capacity as a bundle, or different aspects of it? And I think working on understanding it well enough to be able to translate that kind of conceptual role of institutions and role of governance into something very concrete, to have a discussion with political decision makers, is one way of moving that forward. It's not there now. I fully agree with you there, but I think that's where we need to move as researchers.
Extremely difficult. So, in my view, regarding what norms should take priority and how to redistribute costs and benefits.
I just agree. I don't have to add anything other than possibly separating political will and power. Yeah. Because you can have a lot of political will that doesn't necessarily go with power, unfortunately.
As long as both dimensions are smoothly addressed.
Both need to be addressed, but they're not necessarily in the same actors.
Carmen?
Hi, I'm Carmen Pekarinen. I'm from IASC University, but also in Kent. I think one thing we've forgotten about that was a global accord, which was successful because of a lot of political action, was the Montreal Accord against ozone pollution.
Yep.
And that was successful. So why can't, I always wonder why can't political will be brought together on that kind of a global level to address climate change?
Having followed both the ozone issue and the climate one, I would say the ozone one was simple because you had a small number of very powerful actors whose self-interests changed. And it was the chemical companies that suddenly had an alternative, along with a lot of other issues. But that was a critical one. Whereas you didn't have to change the whole system. Whereas climate change, it's a lot more, since the fossil fuel economy is so embedded in the system, it's much more a systematic change and many, many more actors at various levels, from the big corporations to the individuals in climate change. I think we also have to think about the political opportunities that are coming at different times in history. The Montreal Protocol itself was in the 80s when you still had the West and East locked. But the whole Rio conference in '92 and the signing of the Climate Convention and the Biodiversity Convention and the Agenda 21 and all that came just as the old East and West dynamics was breaking down, and there was kind of an era of hope that, yes, we're going to build a new world together. And today, that optimism is certainly not there. And you have a completely different debate. And I think that also plays into what I was talking about. You break down old structures, it creates opportunities for new. And that's what happened in a sense at that point. Now we are stuck in some other political structures that make it very, very difficult, that also are linked to issues like political power that you were raising. And so I think that's why there are lessons to be learned, but it's not transferable directly, as simple as one would wish.
Wondering whether people at the bottom of the hierarchy have any potential to change what the interests of the powerful are.
I think so. I mean, it probably depends on what you define as the bottom of the hierarchy, but at least ideally, in a democracy, that potential is there. It is much more tricky in countries that are not democratic. But even there, you get to a certain point where you get uprisings. And in order to actually do change something, you can't get it only from top down, because if it isn't grounded in a general will, you won't get the electoral support for emissions. So it's, at least in a democratic setting, it goes both ways.
Several. Elaine, you wait.
Yeah, thank you. When you are talking about political will, it's not sufficient to infuse values and norms into politicians, and then they will do the right thing. Political will comes as much from ability to do something as the goal of doing it. So I wonder about about these negotiators at the global level? Do they really understand the kind of social traps they are trying to negotiate around? Or are they just thinking about their own purse at home?
I would say they work on instructions from their governments, because that's what negotiators do. And those instructions look very different from different countries. But I think national self-interest plays a strong role. That's how the system works in a sense today, and one might say that that's not great, but that's how it works. And that's, in a sense, that's the reality we have to deal with. We can't be wishful thinking that that's not going to be the reality. But I think it's important to also think about issues. How can we frame them? How can we make it clear that these issues are also relevant for things that the actors do perceive as self-interest already today?
I suspect that even if they do realize it, they are still walking into this social trap with their open eyes.
Yeah.
Because the consequences will be unevenly distributed, and timing of curbing actions will make or break fortunes.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, I'm not pretending to be able to solve all global problems.
Now I have Insa and Letizia, and then I think we have to break after that. So please, Insa.
I would also like to come back to the first comment on that we need to analyze a little bit more how can we actually change the norms and values of the actors in place, the local actors. Because I would doubt what you said that we can do it with political power. I mean, political power wouldn't help to change values of people at the grassroots level. If you think of that they are supposed to change their diet, that's something. I mean, that takes lots of information and many, many years till the person finally decided to follow that. That can be nothing that we can implement top down.
That's also why I'm kind of skeptical about, ideas. You talk about planetary boundaries, and you talk about these kind of Earth governance type issues, because I think exactly that that can never get, in a sense, that very needed bottom-up legitimacy in relation to the issues. So, and it's also, I mean, even resilience as a norm is problematic in that sense, especially when you talk about the resilience of Earth as a system, because, I mean, that's not what I care about. I care about my well-being. And it has to be, in a sense, the link between that, and the norms have to be, I think, much more focused, in a sense, on human well-being, and in the sense that there, I think the notion of sustainable development is useful. And I think notions of security, if you talk about it in the broad sense, especially human security, is a useful one, because then you get down to basic norms that you can then argue about whether, those norms should be the ones, but you get a kind of an ethical base to have do we wish people to have a basic human security, like the Millennium Development Goals? There has been a normative development. I think actually if you look back over the past 30 years, it's an enormous normative development internationally in relation to these issues. But I think the term security is one where we need, that would be useful to look closer to see how we could link these issues to them, because I think, I'm not saying that I know this is the word to use, but I think it's worthwhile exploring those linkages.
No, and I agree, and I think the other term is vulnerability. It's vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And I think I have another question that in relation to what Insa said, I think as ecological changes, we cannot expect them to be slow. I think social changes may also came very, very rapidly, and I think information and knowledge play a key role. I think when people perceive a real risk, I mean, like children's cognition abilities being treated seriously, all over the world. It's I mean, as a possible cause for autism. It has arisen a lot of concern, and people have stopped or have demanded. I mean, in the U.S., the vaccine procedure has completely changed because of parents' movement, because they perceive a risk. I think if people have information enough to perceive a risk as real, I mean, changes in values and norms may become more rapid. I think here information, accountability play a key role. But my question was, I mean, I was very glad about your emphasis on the need of trust at different levels and the erosion of trust at the local level. And I think trust is more scarce as you move into different scales. I mean, local actors do not trust global actors and visitors.
No.
So if trust at different levels and different types plays such a key role, which are, I mean, from a very general point of view, the main challenges you see to build trust and the main ways we could work on building trust at different levels? How?
I think one of the ways that is important is, in a sense, having institutions that actually make those global-local linkages in terms of people moving in all parts of the systems, bridge builders, bridging institutions. It's not the answer, but I think it's definitely one aspect that is critical. Because, I mean, you can't have trust if you don't understand the issues at the different scales. That's kind of a necessary foundation to even start. And it's interesting to see in the Arctic how there's been, for good reasons, a lot of mistrust indigenous population to Western scientists, and a lot of needed bridge building. But you also see how the discussion, for example, in the Arctic Council, the onus on including indigenous actors in knowledge production. I can't say that there's still a lot of mistrust, but there are starting to be venues for understanding different perspectives. I think the workshop in County Keynote, for example, is a very good example of where you sit at the table and, you sit very directly and see, okay, yes, now I understand why you see the world this way, and finding fora for that. And that's not an easy way, but it's certainly a necessary way.
Okay, we can continue to discuss this over coffee. I'd like to thank you very much for an interesting keynote with a small gift. Remember us by Umeå with the birches, and then something in tree, of course. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.